All right. Good morning, all. It is Sunday, April 11th. I am so sorry I've been incommunicado for the week. It's been a disastrous week. Not only did our home flood, but we've been bouncing from hotel to hotel. Haven't really had access to any of our electronics. I also caught salmonella from ground turkey, apparently, that the government told me too late about. So that was a rough night, too. And it was my daughter's birthday. So it's been a brutal week. I still don't know when we're going to get into our apartment, but I had a couple hours to myself. I have finally finished grading all the exams. And all of the papers that I have received, insofar as I know. And so if you sent me something and you don't have a grade for it in Canvas, please reach out to me. I think that I am completely caught up, but man, I had a lot of emails to catch up on. So I am so sorry, y'all. We're going to get back on track. And today we're going to be talking about microeconomics, chapter 15. Poverty and economic inequality. These are topics that I am very interested in and drive a lot of my ethnic conflict research. I actually research ethnic conflict cross-comparatively, so looking at different protest and rioting events across all countries over about 40 years and trying to determine whether there are differences between democracies and autocracies when it comes to ethnic conflict and what drives these things in different types of states and even just overall. Anyway, getting off track, but I really like this stuff. I really enjoy studying this stuff, and I think there's a lot here to learn. So this is going to be a pretty long one, and I'm going to post you a little bonus video that I think everybody should see from the University of Harvard, or concerning a University of Harvard study about economic inequality that was made in the mid-2010s, and so economic inequality has actually gotten worse, and even much worse under the auspices of the pandemic. But it's a really, really interesting video, and it'll sort of blow your mind and be like, whoa, I cannot believe it's like that. I mean, it's just when you sort of start to see these things, it's pretty amazing. Okay, here we go. We're going to be talking about poverty first. So, what is poverty? Poverty is living under some specified number of what it takes to live, you know. And so there are so many definitions. The OECD has two different definitions of extreme poverty, one at $1.25 in like 2020 dollars purchasing power parity. You know, we're talking about everything's been leveled out across countries, across economies by how much exactly your $1 gets you in this economy for blah, blah, blah. The poverty line, anyway, $1.25 and $2 are the two OECD basic definitions of extreme poverty, okay? And then they have other just arbitrary lines set, right? They'll look at $5, they'll look at $10. In the United States, right now it's at like $22 per day for a family of a family of four. So you get about $5.50 per day for your whole family of four per person. And that's got to get you through a year. So that's your rent, your food, your car, your utilities, that's what they say the poverty line is. And for one individual in the United States in 2021, the new calculated poverty line number is $12,880. Okay? That's for one individual. And for a family of four, it is $26,500. That is the United States' federal definition of what is the poverty line in the United States, and that is what we base a lot of our means-tested programs, social programs, TANF, SNAP, all of these sorts of programs. We based it on your income, and especially your collective income as a family, and then we want to know how many children do you have, and are you caring for a dependent who is an adult and can't work, or an elderly parent who is retired and cannot work, or all of these sorts of things. But basically, it's $26,500 for a family of four. This poverty line is based on the work of Molly Olshansky in the 1960s. She was a former agriculture department employee who moved over to the Social Security Administration in the 60s and wanted to come up with an actual number of what poverty looks like in America. And so she did a bunch of research, and she said, okay, in America in this year, the U.S. government says about 1/3 of your family income is spent on food for the average family of four at a median salary or whatever. You're taking the most normal American family, right? And we want to base everything on them, right? What is the median family of four, the white picket fence, the two dogs, and 1.5 children or whatever, what would it take to feed them? And they said it would take 1/3 of their salary per annum in this, it was 1964, 1965. And so that number basically became the poverty line. this 1/3 of the definition for what the poverty line is. This 1/3 of the median family's income is the poverty line, and that's what it would take to give a proper nutritional diet to a family of four. Okay. All right, and you sort of see where this came from, right? She came from the agricultural department and learning how to feed families and nutritional support and these sorts of things. Then she moved into the Social Security Administration, which was more based on just reducing poverty overall. And so her thoughts on food and stuff went into this huge indicator that we use for our economy. So it's pretty neat stuff, pretty cool stuff. How even agricultural scientists can lead to really neat data techniques and advances in things that aren't even really related to agriculture, right? So I like that sort of thing. I used to work in appraisal as a political scientist and an economist because I needed to feed my family while I was in graduate school. So, it's kind of neat the things that you could bring. And I won a bunch of national awards for my models for the appraisal work that I did while I was also at the university. And I got to bring this sort of university viewpoint and this modeling statistics and economic viewpoint to appraisal work and valuation of housing all across my entire county. And I helped even out the fairness of the taxation system in our county, which was really cool. So I was very proud of that work. So anyway, the idea that you could bring research from something completely different to a new area and really expand things, and I love that sort of thing. I love when they do that with economics. I love the idea that, art can be economics, and evolutionary biology can be economics, and human behaviorism can be economics, and aggregate psychology can be economics, and it's fun. Okay, anyway, so I'm off track again, but I like this stuff. Income inequality is rising. And there are a lot of different ways to measure income inequality. We will talk about a lot of these different measures because there are massively different implications to be made depending on what measures you use. Some measures make it look like there's no inequality. Some measures make it look like, whoa, inequality is through the roof. Or that poverty isn't so bad. Or if we use this measure, it's like, oh man, poverty is really bad in America. And childhood poverty, especially like 1 in 5 or between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children in America lives in poverty and has nutritional depreciation in their life. And so these are it's kind of a scary thought, right? 1 in 5 kids doesn't get enough food in America, in this country. That's wild, given how much money there is here. Okay. So, if you, usually the way that we measure inequality is by taking some measure of wealth. Usually this is income, So they'll take the tax data from the IRS and they'll break out all of the income down from like, I made $1 this year, that person out there who like worked for 6 minutes and then quit their job and was like, I'm going home. That guy or lady, all the way up to like the uber billionaire, we're talking about like the Bill Gates set, so we're going to line out all of that data in a long string, and then we're going to break it out into usually deciles or quintiles. And so a decile is into tenths. So we'll take this tenth and then this tenth and then this tenth all the way up, and we'll sort of just break out the data and look at how they compare, or we'll compare the bottom 10 to the top 10, or with quintiles, which is fifths. Okay, so I'll take the bottom fifth of income earners and compare them to the top fifth, and let's see how much, how they compare. That's how the Gini index from the University of Texas is constructed, is with quintiles and income, quintiles and income. And we will talk about other measures of wealth. We don't necessarily need to base this on income, because income is a really, it's not a very useful understanding of wealth, right? And so if we start taking in stocks, bonds, assets, land, inequality just skyrockets, especially when you're just compared about wealth. And we will talk about the sort of CEO salary game that they play to keep that the wealth number, the income number down, while wealth continues to increase. And this is especially a game that they play in America. All right. You can see in figure 15.2 that poverty changes over time, right? Poverty isn't stable. And so when you have hard times, like you did in the early 1960s, when we had a lot of riots, there was a lot of income inequality, there was a lot of racial tension, there was a lot of unemployment, and then you also had the mass migration of black citizens from sort of the segregationist South toward the North, and so there was a lot of sort of disruption in that sense as well. So the 1960s are a really roiling point. You have really high rates of poverty, and then the Civil Rights Act helped to bring some of that down. Right? Civil Rights Act is one, but there's really like a grouping of civil rights acts which are passed between basically 1963 and 1965. And it was basically Kennedy and then LBJ, who was sort of a yellow dog Democrat from the South. It's a thing that doesn't really exist anymore, but there used to be Democrats in the South, okay, and LBJ was one of them, and it was they were called yellow dog Democrats. They still believed in free enterprise and the free market and sort of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mantra of the free market economics, but they also believed in actual equality and making institutions equal and education equal, because those are the tenets of that actual free market society, right? And so they were also, while they were sort of today's conservative on economics, they were sort of today's liberal on social issues, right? And so these are yellow dog Democrats. Anyway, so yellow dog Democrats, LBJ and John F. Kennedy, they pushed through the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s. It reduces just the base racism in the system, and a lot of people are able to sort of pull themselves up. And you see, at least in the minority communities and a lot of even just impoverished white communities, you start to see a little bit of a rise out of poverty and into that sort of lower middle class, at least, right? And then poverty starts to increase a little bit in the 1980s. And this is because of the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration comes in and sort of uses welfare and welfare queens, as they like to, sort of the buzzword at the time. Welfare queens are sucking resources out of the system, and they're just out there having millions of babies and trying to collect government checks. And, you guys have all heard this stuff. So that was a big part of the 1980s. But we also saw some pretty devastating economic consequences in the 1980s that were leading to rising poverty. So it wasn't just about people didn't want to work and they were lazy and they were just having lots of babies to collect government welfare. It's because the late 1970s were disastrous. And we saw stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation rates. The Fed had to kick the interest rates way up in the 1980s, which caused even more problems in the broader economy with the expectations of future profits. And so you could see how this happens, right? The 1990s were pretty nice because I wouldn't even necessarily say it's because of the changes that Clinton brought to the poverty legislation. Instead of that, it was about the economy is just kicking butt, right? In the 1990s, this is under Alan Greenspan, but it's really not even about sort of the deregulation of Reagan and Bush 1 and Clinton. It's more about the dot-com boom and this explosion because of this investment that the United States had put into the R&D of the internet, right? And so this incredible investment that we got out of Cal, Stanford, these sort of really far west schools that were working on the original sort of DARPA internet project. We're finally starting to bring some of that stuff into the office, and to be able to use these things because of Moore's law, this ever expanding, exponentiated usage and strength and miniaturization of computer products. And so the 1990s explode, right? I mean, we have one of the greatest economies the world has ever seen. And a lot of economists look back now and say that Greenspan and others were actually, they screwed up. That they should not have been running zero interest economies, and they should not have been deregulating. They should have taken this boom period as a chance to sort of raise taxes, spend money on infrastructure and research and development, and sort of push that supply curve, that LRAS out, like we've talked about in the supply side model. But they failed to do so. And instead, they just cut taxes, they burned out the economy as hot as they possibly could. And then in 2007 and 2008, after a generation of deregulation and false economic growth, we got a complete massive collapse. And that is where we see the last jump on our graph, figure 15.2, which was under the late Bush 2 administration when the housing market collapsed and we got these sub-collateralized loans and these default trade swaps and et cetera, et cetera. If you want to go read up on the crash of 2008. But poverty shot through the roof. We started working on it, and the Obama administration did a pretty good job, at least sort of from economic consensus. The Obama administration was really, really well run from an economic standpoint, and we got things back on track. But then COVID just kicked our butts, and I wouldn't even necessarily blame that on Donald Trump. Maybe on his policies and his inaction, but it's mostly the whole world is dealing with this, right? And so some countries have dealt with it better than others, and I'm not saying America has dealt with it the best, especially if you look at Southeast Asia, but everyone is dealing with this explosion in poverty yet again, which is why the Biden administration pushed through this $2 trillion package, and now we're looking at infrastructure. We're trying to use that neo-Keynesian side of it instead of the supply side of it again. So hopefully it works. The numbers are looking really good so far. We got an amazing jobs report last month, way better than expected. Vaccines are way ahead of pace. Things are looking pretty good, and the stock market has been a little wavery, but I would say the stock market is not really a great indicator of where America is, right? Of where sort of the middle class median American is, as we'll talk about it. The vast majority of Americans really don't even own a single stock. So I wouldn't get too excited about the stock market. It hasn't been an indicator of American economic health for a very long time. It's more of an indicator of how the very upper echelons perceive the future to look. All right, let's move on. Gender and age. You can see that women tend to always be more likely to fall into poverty. This is for a number of reasons. Women tend to be left with children alone way more often than men. I was actually a single father, so I'm proud of that. I've raised my girl since the day she was born, but it was just me and her for about 5 or 6 years, and it's hard. It is so hard. The poverty and the stress and it's hard to do, but it was worth it. It was worth it. But generally, it's the lady who has the responsibility of taking care of the child. Whether that's from social pressures or legal responsibilities or whatever. I mean, you insert your own whatever here. I don't want to get involved in any of that. But whether it is in the developed world or the developing world, almost always women tend to be impoverished more than men. They tend to be paid less. They tend to have children more. They tend to be single more. They also had a lot less free time to go get an education or to work their way through a career, to work up to higher income brackets. There's a lot there, right? And there's so much research out there. I would say if you're interested in this, there's a lot there. It's a really interesting topic, but just know that it's generally women who tend to be impoverished more often than men, and it's generally the young and the old, especially in developing societies. You get the young and the very old who are the most impoverished, so it makes sort of this thing. Here in the United States, in this graph that I provided, the elderly are less likely to be taken care of. This is because elderly are such strong voters in America. And so the elderly have taken care of themselves. They've said, look, we're old and we're poor and we need something. And people really helped to push that through in the 1930s. And the elderly tend to be the strongest voting bloc in America and even in the developed world. And so sadly, children can't vote, and children cannot represent their own needs, and so children tend to be the ones who are left out. Weirdly, this is mostly in the developed world. In the developing world, there's more of a communal raising of the children. There's still extraordinary poverty rates, so don't get me wrong. It's not like they're doing better than us. It's a little more balanced out between elderly and pretty much across the population, right? Okay, so moving on. Here, if you look at, that was not just comparative statistics, not just the United States. If you look at the next one where women are more at risk of poverty, it sort of shows you where men and women rate in all of these different countries across the world. And you can see that there's a pretty big gap in the United States compared to most of the rest of the developed world. So South Korea and it looks like maybe Japan, which are very male-centric societies, if you sort of know anything about those societies, and Confucianism and the system that they've built of familial relations and paternalism and all of these things. So all of that plays into it, right? But I would also say that Israel sort of has those same ideas, and so does Spain, and so does Mexico, these sort of chauvinist societies, and they don't have these problems that America and Korea and Japan do, where women are basically like, forget women, we need men to make money, and women are secondarily thought of. So it's a strange phenomenon, and I'd really like to see research on this. I want to actually talk to my dissertation chairman about this because he studies gender politics, and so I think we could maybe write a paper together about why are some societies having such small gaps. Yes, women are still more likely to be impoverished than men for the most part, but why are some so wide, like in America and Korea and Japan? Anyway, moving on. Questions. I always have questions. That's the joy of science, right? Just let's find new answers to these weird puzzles we find. Okay, the poverty trap. The poverty trap is the idea that sometimes government subsidies and government programs can incentivize poverty and can incentivize a lack of. They can disincentivize work, right? So if, as in this guarantee, as in figure 15.3, it says that the United States government is going to guarantee you an income of $18,000 no matter how many hours you work, right? And at minimum wage, basically, it suggests that you should just sit at home under the assumptions of this specific model, right? And I wouldn't say, like, this isn't the real world. Don't think that. These are the assumptions so that you can sort of see how this works. If you look at the next one, 15.4, here's the idea that we're not going to give you just a base 18 grand. Actually, we are, but we're going to incentivize you pushing further than that, right? We want to set a base income for whatever reason. A lot of countries are approaching this idea. It's called the Universal Basic Income Principle. And it was espoused by Andrew Yang, if you remember, in the Democratic presidential debates. And the idea is that you take redistribution and you guarantee every single citizen in your country a basic income. I don't care if you're a 3 billionaire or if you're that person that sent in a tax return for $1 last year, right? That we talked about earlier. If you are a citizen of this country, I will send you, Andrew Yang said $1,000 a month. And some of the Icelandic nations, the Nordic countries, Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, these sort of countries are mulling this over and have run some experiments, some really cool experiments. So the idea is I'm going to give you $1,000 a month per citizen, right? Or maybe even just per family or something like that. But let's just say I'm giving you $1,000 a month per citizen. So my daughter and I would get $2,000 per month. It would be a base salary of $24,000, and I don't have to do a single thing, right? I can just stay home. Now, what are the benefits of this, right? I can think of a lot of detractors. The detractors are, I don't go to work, right? And so I'm losing my job skills. I'm losing the potential job skills that I could be building. I'm losing my networking that I could also be developing. I'm not driving. I'm not buying lunches at work. There's a lot of different detractors. There are also some benefits, which may surprise some people. The benefits are that you keep the economy rolling. Regardless of someone's, regardless of someone's need for this money, right? They will get it. So this is gonna go to the lazy as well as to the industrious. It's going to go to people who are between jobs. It's going to go to people who are just underpaid. It's going to go to the mentally and physically disabled. It's going to go to everyone and to every child in the country, which will reduce child poverty and child malnutrition and things of this sort, right? And so you are also guaranteeing that all of this money, $12,000 per person, is probably going to be dumped into the economy because this is the basic need that every human needs to live, right? In the United States, it would almost exactly match up to what we are calling our poverty level, $12,880. So basically, if you take about, what is that, 65 to 70 bucks off every month, you get 1,000, and you get your 12,000 for the year. And this is what the United States government says you have to live. Like you cannot live. You cannot survive in this nation without that much money, right? And so that much money is guaranteed to be put into the market, and will be helping the market in that it will be bank deposits, it will be purchases, it will be businesses being opened, it will be all of these things. And sort of the neo-Keynesian side of the argument kicks in, and we are just pushing demand. It reduces inequality, it reduces child poverty, it reduces malnutrition. So there are some positives to this idea. Yes, it would involve redistribution, and it may cause some people to be lazy. But I think if I got $1,000 a month, I'd still go to work. I mean, I love this job. I love what I do. So why would I not go to work? Some people would probably take the advantage and not go to work and just take their $12,000. But again, there are benefits from that. It's better for the economy, and it's better for those children, and it's better long run for really everyone. For at least that base minimum to be spent, because then we're not having to spend money on trying to get those kids healthy later in life, trying to get back that lost intellectual development that you can never really get back, right? That's human capital lost. Trying to pay for like anti-poverty programs and homelessness programs, and all of that stuff would kind of disappear, right? Because you're providing everyone with a base minimum living standard, right? So I think there's some really interesting arguments, and there's been some very interesting experiments, and I would say that I don't know if we should implement this yet, right? There's a lot to be learned first. But it would be cool if the U.S. government would start some experiments on how this would work, or maybe one state start some experiments. That's one of the great things about our federal system, is that our states can employ different ideas, and then we can research them and compare them through what are called natural experiments. And so I can't wait to see some of this stuff, because it could be a complete flop. It really could be, right? Like, oh man, nobody wants to work. But it could be a net benefit too, and I don't want to just rule it out completely yet. So anyway, let's move on. The safety net. So we're going to talk about some of the history of social safety nets, and especially in America, right? As far as I know, we really don't have an international safety net other than sort of like food aid when there's droughts and starvation crises, that sort of thing. So we will just focus on the American system. So you have some idea of at least how our economy works, and some of the politics and the history and everything behind where we are with welfare and where the American state has been in the past. All right. So from basically the 1930s, this is under the tutelage of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and the New Deal program. From that point, and the passing of the Social Security Act and all of this stuff, until 1996, we had one singular overarching policy, basically, and it was called the AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. So this is a 60-year program. It was our first stab at a real social safety net other than Social Security for the elderly and for the disabled. But this is our first stab at sort of an overarching welfare policy, okay? It is the aid to families with dependent children. It basically was just a flat payment that went out, and some states put it on like coupons, almost like these rip out stamps you could use in lieu of dollars. Today we'll talk about it's on a debit card, and we'll talk about why. There were some problems with the system, right? It was not well managed. It wasn't well managed. The data collection was terrible. The management of who got access to the money was not very good. Some people were using it just for decades on end. Some people had duplicates. They were getting paid 2 or 3 or 4 times, or they were claiming that they had like 6 kids that they didn't have. There were real problems with this system. There were good things, right? Of course, all of the things that we talked about earlier, like helping kids grow and develop and eat a good nutritional meal, putting a roof over someone's head, these sorts of things, right? I think that we have a moral obligation as a society to give people at least some modicum of a respect and a decent life, right? Especially kids who have no control over what they did or why they're there or anything, right? They're kids. They don't deserve to be hungry. I think regardless of what you think about welfare for adults, it's hard to say that kids should go hungry just because of the choices of their either irresponsible or whatever parents, right? So anyway, that's my soapbox for the day. Children shouldn't starve. I don't think that's all that touchy a subject, but there were a lot of problems with the AFTC. And like I just said, and it really started to take a hit under the Reagan administration, because as we talked about, the unemployment rolls were rising after the sort of economic devastation of the late 1970s, the stagflation, the lines for gasoline and the gasoline cards that people were having to use. You could only get gasoline on certain days. The extraordinary oil prices because of the OPEC controlling the market and sucking in the supply. We've talked about sort of how they can collude, right? That was one of the few times that they've actually done it right and kind of screwed everyone on earth and made them pay extraordinary costs to say, look, you will respect us. That they really put the whole world in a bind in the late 1970s, and that was and we also had the Iranian embassy, 444 Americans captured, or Americans captured for 444 days. There was a lot going on. Reagan came in, and people were mad that the budget was sort of ballooning because of the welfare rolls, and so Reagan and conservatives started to sort of malign welfare queens, is what they called it. These fat mamas who sat and had a whole bunch of kids and were just sort of sucking the teat of the American government. I'm sure some of that existed, but it was mostly political. And so the Reagan administration really couldn't get anything through. And then Bush 1 couldn't get anything through because our economy was still kind of in trouble, and people really did actually need the money at the time. And we were going through some severe economic pain because Paul Volcker had to kick up, who was the Fed chairman at the time in the mid-1980s, had to kick up the interest rates a lot to try and slow down the inflation, because that was like the last time we saw inflation. Was in the 1980s. And so Paul Volcker did the brave thing and the hard thing and the thing that Reagan just hated him for, because presidents don't want that to happen, right? They want the economy to keep going because I want to get reelected. And so Paul Volcker stepped in and said, I'm sorry, this is just what we have to do. I'm the central bank. I have a responsibility to do what's right for the economy, and we have to kick up interest rates so that we have leverage against future economic collapse. Okay. So Reagan wasn't able to get it through. Bush wasn't able to get it through because he was in trouble because he was saying, I'm going to have to raise taxes. We need government funding for infrastructure and research and everything we need government funding for. Bush isn't able to get it through. Clinton comes in, and Clinton is riding high on the economy, on this tech bubble, on this internet bubble that we talked about. And so Clinton is actually able to push something through because not only is he riding high on this tech bubble, but he's also a Democrat, right? From the South. He's one of these like dying breed yellow dog Democrats. And so he has a little more legitimacy from the people on the left who generally tend to be the ones who need these social safety nets. And we're talking about sort of the elderly poor, the poor in general, blacks and Hispanics who tend to be more likely to be poor because of the social situation in America. And we'll talk about some of that too. But Clinton is able to push it through. And they make this massive change to our social welfare system. And in 1996, TANF passes, and it replaces the AFDC, right? It has some other long-winded name, but just remember TANF. And this is temporary assistance for needy families. The two main tenets of this were that we're putting time limits on welfare, and that was the very first one. And we're going to put work requirements on welfare. So most of you, at least if you don't have kids or you're not disabled, you have to work. And if you're working, we're willing to help you. But if you don't work and you don't have kids, like too bad. That's the AFDC. I mean, excuse me, that's TANF. There was also a 5-year limit, right, over your entire life. If you are, at least as an adult, once you turn 18 and you become the main enrollee, then your time limit kicks in, right? And so you have a 5-year limit on your ability to draw from TANF. And it's a lifetime cap. Once you hit that 5 years, like you're done forever, until they change the law, basically. Or unless you can get some sort of like, okay, I became disabled and now I'm unable to work, this sort of thing. And even then they have other programs, I think. So for the most part, like you're just SOL. If you've hit your 5-year limit, go, I'm sorry for you kind of thing. Okay. But it also dramatically changed the way that the federal government paid for programs. In the past, under the AFDC, what happened was the state would basically set each of the 50 states, and we probably didn't have 50 during that whole time, but you get my meaning. Each of the states chose their own level of welfare under the AFDC, and the federal government basically said, we'll kick in a percentage, right? And we will kick in a percentage for every recipient you have. And so this changed, right? And also the implications of that policy are that you have an automatic stabilizer, right? As unemployment rolls increase and the economy is dipping and unemployment is increasing, so is federal spending. Automatically, without anyone touching anything, federal spending is increasing, which stimulates the economy. This is the idea of the automatic welfare stabilizer, right? We get rid of that. And so it's got benefits and it's got problems, and we'll talk about those. Now, instead of matching per recipient, some percentage per recipient in each state, now what they do is they just give the state a flat sum, and they say, all right, Texas, here's your $2 billion. I don't know what it is, but here's your hypothetical $2 billion for the year. This is your welfare money. And then the state can take that $2 billion and they can spend it on whatever qualifies as poverty reduction, right? And so this might be direct payments. This might be healthcare payments. This might be help for the elderly to pay for their prescriptions. This might be school meals. It might be orphanages. It might be Oh man, just think of something like pregnancy reduction in teens. It could be free condoms. Like, I mean, there are a lot of different things you could think of that would qualify as poverty reduction, right? Even really tangentially. So now the state has more power over how the money is spent, but the automatic stabilizer is gone because regardless of how high or how low unemployment gets, the federal government just pays you your flat fee every year. And it's probably annualized to be adjusted for inflation or, with the new budget passing, that sort of thing. But there's no automatic stabilizer. There's no automatic kick-in that can help the economy when it's doing poorly and can reduce the federal government's spending when it's doing well. So I would say this isn't necessarily a great way to spend this money. And I think that most economists that I've studied also say that we should probably at least get back to the automatic welfare stabilizing system where we can reduce our federal spending during good times and increase it during bad without politicians having to do anything or waste any time, arguing while people are desperate. And it'll also help us balance our budget when things are well. So it wasn't a very well thought out plan, at least from that perspective, okay? All right, we're going to move on. The Earned Income Tax Credit. This was from 1975. This is one of the biggest redistribution policies in America. This is a really, really big one. And this is just like, we'll give you money back if you work. If you're under, I think it's 46,226. It's somewhere around 50 grand, right? If you make less than 50 grand, we'll give you some of your taxes back. And you can't get this if you don't work. So this is a nice way for the government to incentivize working, but also sort of kick a little back to the people who aren't doing extraordinarily well, right? This is also expanding. The Democratic Party just passed the new legislation under the CARES Act, and this will be expanding pretty dramatically, and is supposed to, at least under the projections from the Congressional Budget Office, it is supposed to reduce child poverty pretty dramatically by like half the number of kids who live in poverty right now will no longer be in poverty because of the rejigging of the system. They're going to spread out the payments over time, and they're going to increase your kickback on your childhood tax credits, which is the CTC, which is really tied into the EITC, okay? And this is supposed to really help reduce both poverty, but also especially child poverty. All right, we have SNAP, and this is the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, which was passed also in the mid-1960s during the Civil Rights era. This was supposed to help with food expenditures. Originally, this was just basically a cash payout, like they'd send you a check. Or maybe you had like literally stamps, like this counts as $5 worth of food or whatever. But these things like, you guys live in rural Utah and I live in rural Texas. But in major cities like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Philly, you have what are called bodegas, and they're sort of a mix between a convenience store and a grocery store and sort of your daily coffee shop, and you can get some basic household goods. They also sell what are called loosies. It's a single cigarette. You could just buy one cigarette, that sort of thing. They've made this illegal since, but a lot of these bodega owners were taking these food stamps for not food, right? For booze, for cigarettes, these sorts of things. So they put some limits on these things. And now they give you a debit card, and your debit card has to match up the UPCs on your receipt with food, and anything that is not food will not be covered. I mean, it'll just say, all right, you owe us $83.70 for, your TP and your, I don't know, WD-40 and your beer. We're not paying for that stuff, So it's become a much more securitized system under the new debit card programs, and with the advent of UPCs and computerization, has become a much, much better program. It's a lot less likely to be abused. It still happens really rarely, where like another family will buy food with your card and trade you cash. But, I don't think there's really, like, when you get down to it, human ingenuity can find crazy ways to cheat. Like, I don't know how you stop that. I don't know if it even happens enough to be worth trying to stop. Because at least someone's getting food, I guess. I don't really know. But it has become much, much, much more secure. We have seen enormous jumps in 2008 and in 2020 in our SNAP enrollees because of, first, the housing bubble crash, and now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You also have some others. You have subsidized school lunches. You have WIC, which is called Women, Infant, and Children. They provide a very small amount of, we'll give you 2 pounds of cheese, 6 gallons of milk, a pound of beans, that sort of thing. It's a pretty weird program. We were enrolled under it when I had my daughter, when I was in graduate school, living, on pennies. And working, 80 hours a week, and it was rough. But yeah, I mean, it was cool because literally every bit helped at that time. We could use every gallon of milk that we got, and all the nutritional help that we could use. Because my wife at the time wasn't working, and I'm a graduate student and delivering food, 40 hours a week on the side. And just pulling my hair out because I'm working so hard and still struggling. So it was tough, but it was really nice that we had some programs that helped us, and now we contribute, which is the point. You sort of give people that bump up, and then they will be paying in, and they will have gotten an education, or that sort of thing. So. I don't feel bad for ever having taken it. We needed the help pretty badly. Okay. HUD is housing. There are a couple different ways that they can do this. They can basically cut you a check for a portion of your rent so that you can live in a non-HUD housing, because HUD housing can get pretty scary. Just because everyone there is impoverished, and you start collecting, every family in your community is impoverished, things can get out of hand. Because there's a lot of stress, and there's a lot of violence, and there's a lot of not being able to deal with emotions, and poverty, and all of these sorts of things. So these can be very, they can be places that you might not necessarily want to live. And so to help ease some of that stuff, they've started offering vouchers instead. We're not trying to ghettoize poor people is basically the new concept. That's what the Nazis did. It's not really a pleasant thing to do. That's what we did to the Japanese in the 40s. And there's been a lot of pushback in the recent decades about, look, you're just ghettoizing these people. It's not helping them. You're just forcing them out of sight into terrible conditions anyway. So they've shifted the program toward more, all right, go find decent housing and we will help you to pay for it, which has been a nice transition. Let's see, Health and Human Services, this is medical, that sort of stuff. We also have Medicaid, which is for the vast majority of Medicaid is spent on pregnant mothers, children, the very elderly, and the highly disabled, the people who cannot work for themselves. And they have to pass an extraordinary number of tests and poking and prodding and paperwork and this and that. like 6 different doctors need to say, yeah, you can't work. And yeah, I used to rent a room from a lady in my youth who was had spine issues, and man, this poor lady, the hoops that they made this poor woman jump through, it's like, God, you might as well just go, like, it's gotta be frustrating, because, like, it's almost like a job just trying to jump through all these hoops all the time. So, and she was clearly like she's not trying to fake the system. So, I felt bad for her. All right. Let's move on. Income inequality. All right. I know this is a long one, but this is the only chapter for the week, so we got a pretty long one here. Should probably pause me and take a little break, because we still probably have another 20 minutes to go. Okay. Section 15.4, Income Inequality, Measurements and Causes. All right. Here, I just want to sort of talk to you about trends. You can see that income inequality changes dramatically over time, right? If you look at this graph, evolution of the Gini index for the U.S., that was kindly provided to us from Olivier Berrier, you can see that the Gini index increases dramatically right after basically right before the collapse in the 1930s, right before Black Tuesday, the Depression, and this collapse of our economy. And then you see all of these New Deal programs being put into place in the middle 1930s and the early 1940s. And you see inequality dropping dramatically. You also see the civil rights movement, which also further helps to reduce inequality. But since the 1970s or so, we've moved toward a more deregulatory system. And this has been under both Democrats and Republicans. This is sort of what we know now as the neoliberal model, which is catching a lot of flack in recent times. But this is the idea that we are going to globalize, we are going to specialize our economy, we are going to export, we are going to import as many cheap goods as we can get, we are going to promote trade, we are going to de-unionize, and we are going to deregulate the economy and just let companies sort of do whatever they want. Sometimes this is a really good thing because it can lead to innovation, it can lead to greater efficiencies, but it can also be a really bad thing because it can lead to price gouging, it can lead to exploitation. So it's a mixed bag, right? And so at least from an income inequality perspective, it hasn't been mixed. It's been deregulation and the neoliberal model cause extraordinary inequality, especially in the highly deregulated American context. And you're talking about America is as unequal as African nations, Mexico. We are one of the most unequal nations on earth, and we're really nowhere close to our European rivals where their societies are a lot more equal. There's still wild inequality, don't get me wrong. It's just not as extreme as in America. So if we move, and this is also like, again, just like with earlier, this trend has reduced under the Obama administration, but then popped again under COVID. So we are seeing this rise yet again. The Lorenz Curve is a nice way of sort of graphically expressing how this relationship works. So if you take the different quintiles and add up their cumulative share of income, and I would say we're going to talk about wealth rather than income because it's much more like you go, whoa. And we'll talk about why too. But if you line these up, now the flatter this curve gets, the more unequal it is, right? Like that sharper that incline at the end. That means the high income people have the most, the largest proportion of the total income in the economy, right? And you can see that this is flattening out over time. Curving out over time. It is getting worse. It's bowing further down. All right. Here is the Gini inequality over multiple countries. So instead of just looking at the United States, now we're looking at the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is sort of the collective of the world's developed, I'd say, like, first tier and high second tier nations, all right? And here you can see that the least unequal societies on Earth are those self-same Scandinavian countries: Iceland, Norway, Slovenia, Denmark, Finland. And then once you move over to the very far side, you see the OECD average, which is about, the top 10% own 32% of the entire society's wealth. But if you look at the United States, we are one of the most unequal in the OECD. So Chile and Mexico surpass us pretty broadly too. And this is a lot to do with oil. But then the United States is next, and we are with Turkey, not a good country. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the sort of Muslim extremist president, anti-democracy, not a good state. Israel, also a really extreme state, a lot of racism and oppression, not very democratic. And then we have Estonia, a former Soviet Union nation, Latvia. It's not good. We're not looking good when it comes to inequality in America. And it's even worse. Like, that is just income, right? And if you look at the bottom, at the next graph, this is also income. But the black diamond is wealth. And it is wild. The top 20% of America wealth owners own 89% of all wealth in the United States. Think about that. The top 20% of earners in the United States own 90% of all the wealth. This is income, land, assets, art, stocks and bonds. The stuff that is intergenerational, the stuff that helps families over time, is just getting sucked up by the super rich. And everyone else, the entire bottom 80% own 10% of America's entire wealth. That is wild. That's wild. And we are just off the charts relative to all of the rest of the developed world, and we're sort of in the autocracy, like, we're just going to corruptly steal all your stuff area, like Egypt and Somalia and these sorts of states. So I find this to be embarrassing for our country. I find it to be highly, highly economically disabling, right? There is so much money that is not being spent. That is so much money that is not being invested. It is so much money that is not going to human capital, that is not going to expenditures in the market, that is going to false economics, like the stock market, passing down wealth to your kids. I don't know. I find this very disappointing, and I find this to be a real drag on our economy. And most economists think that this is a huge, huge drag on our potential GDP. let's see. Another one, if you look at the next one, share of income growth going to income groups from 1975 to 2007, you can see that this is, while this is a problem across the developed world, this is a specifically American problem. And Britain also has this issue where they just sort of allow the exploitation of the lower class. So it's really interesting to see that the different phenomena, it seems to be tied to sort of British imperialist thought, Protestantism, all of these different movements. Very interesting. All right, let's get down to why is some of this inequality growing? Why are we seeing this shift in inequality? The book gives some really wimpy, really wimpy ideas on why this is happening. Yes, all of them do play a role, but they're not very strong. So the first thing that they mention is this coupling of high-powered earners has changed since the 1960s, right? The look of the American family has changed. Instead of just the sort of docile wife who goes out and gets a cashier job or stays at home, now you have doctor and doctor marrying each other and stealing all the upper income. Come on. I mean, it's such a small proportion of our society that it really doesn't explain the vast underpinnings of inequality, right? So we're moving on. Single-parent households have increased dramatically, and this is a pretty decent contributor to this inequality problem. We know that single-parent families are the most likely to be impoverished. We know they're the most likely to have children who also grow up to be impoverished. They have problems with the job market because they're not stable in their life. Their education is usually bad. They have psychological issues. They're less likely to be able to go to college and get a real education. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of problems with the single parent family, and I don't know how to fix that. That's not my purview, but it is a contributor, so it should be mentioned. Moving on, winner take all labor market. This doesn't have a lot to do with it, but it is a tiny contributor. Everybody wants a star CEO, and they pay them way more than they're worth. All of the research suggests that you shouldn't be paying these guys anywhere close to this amount of money. You could pay anyone else with that type of education, and there really wouldn't be much different in performance. So the winner take all market, they sort of make this metaphor of the sports stars now, how their salaries are exploding, and I guess it's about the same, but at least sports stars actually do contribute to winning. The research suggests that maybe these CEOs don't contribute much, at least relative to similarly trained and educated individuals. All right, those are the three from the book. I'm going to give you some of my ideas from my years and years of research. Declines in unions. If we look at unions across America and across the advanced world, there is a direct correlation between income inequality and the declination of unions. And there is and it makes sense, right? It makes not only data sense, because there's plenty of data out there to suggest it, but it makes logical sense, right? Firms have a lot of power. They have millions or billions of dollars. You are one person, right? And so me telling Walmart, you gotta pay me more or I'm gonna quit. Walmart's like, then quit. Who cares? I'll go out and find someone else who will take $7, right? And this is the same sort of thing with Amazon and Uber and all of these different things. When you get a labor union to collectivize the beliefs and power of all of the individual workers, of course this changes the leverage in the system, right? Where now the firm doesn't have all the powers. The union can now hire high-class attorneys, just like the firm has 17 of them, right? the union can now hire an expert litigator and negotiator, whereas the firm already has 3 on staff, right? And so it helps to balance things out, and it absolutely reduces the gap between the highest paid in the firm and the lowest paid in the firm, and even just the average or median worker and the highest worker, okay? I don't really think there's much question about it. I would also say that unions, not unions, but firms spend billions upon billions of dollars on fighting unions and on demonizing unions in newspapers, on media, and even like if you've been paying attention to the recent vote on unionization in Alabama. There's a Amazon factory in Alabama, not factory, an Amazon facility in Alabama with thousands upon thousands of workers. Workers are pissed off because they're not being treated very well, and they wanted to unionize. Well, Amazon made their employees go to anti-union meetings, and they paid highly professional anti-union speakers to come and explain why unions are bad. Like that's a weird thing, right? And so, yes, the firm has an incentive not to allow you to unionize. They don't want you to unionize. They don't want you to have any power. They want you as an individual to have to face their billions of dollars, right? And so the decline of unions and the demonization of unions over the years has led to a serious gap in inequality. And they can be directly tracked on data. The next one is the salary versus stock game. And this is a nasty game that has been played in the last 20 or so years after the deregulation of Alan Greenspan and sort of the Clinton and Bush 2 era. What is happening is CEOs know that they're getting pushback against their salary. People are really frustrated. Like, why are you making $40 million this year and you have a bankrupt bank? It doesn't make any damn sense. It just doesn't make sense, right? And you're getting paid bonuses. This is what we saw after 2008. Like you have a bank that is going into the ground. You're declaring bankruptcy, and yet you're walking away with a $40 million salary and a $15 million bonus on the year. That doesn't make sense. And so there's been a lot of pushback against this. So instead of actually changing things, CEOs have made it worse. They've reduced their quote-unquote salary, and they've started taking stocks in the company that they run so that they can claim that their salary is lower and that their stock performance will be based upon their performance as a CEO, right? That makes perfect sense, but it's BS. What is really happening is these companies and the CEOs in general will give themselves buku bucks in stocks, right? And say that I'm going to base my salary on my stock performance. So I'm going to take $1 million in salary, $30 million in today's stock value, and then I can't sell it for a year or something, right? A year goes by. Then what they do is they take the profits that their company is making, or they sell off some assets or whatever, and they just buy back these stocks a little bit at first, a little bit more, and they start driving up the price of the stock artificially. This is not real performance. They start driving up the value of the stock. They burn through all of their stock and collect cash on an artificially inflated amount of value, and then collect the cash out of the system, and then they pay only about 8% in taxes on these dividends. This is a nasty game, and there are a lot of politicians who are starting to become wise to it, and there's a lot of pressure on these companies to stop pulling this BS. So the more you know, the more powerful you can be, and you can say, look, wait a second, Apple isn't actually performing in this incredible. They're just doing stock buybacks. And they're driving up the price. They're walking away with billions of dollars in cash, not paying taxes on it. It's nasty. It's nasty. Okay, finally, extremely low safety net systems due to heterogeneity. This is a problem in America specifically. So, when you start looking at the world, and developed countries especially, you will find that in those countries where people tend to look the same, you will get much, much higher levels of social safety nets. And in those countries where there are different racial or ethnic groups, people are a lot less willing to help others. Okay? And you see this not only cross-comparatively, where America and some of the more diverse states like France, Britain, countries like this, have really poor safety net systems. They also have really unequal education systems, which we will talk about. They have very little welfare redistribution. There are other issues that we will talk about in America, but when people look other, people are less willing to help. And this is a sad but true fact that we find across the world. We also find it across American states. We also find it in American cities. And so regardless of what level we're looking at, if we're looking at the international scale, if we're looking at a national scale, if we're looking at a subnational scale, or even a local scale, this tendency always plays out. And so in countries like the Scandinavian countries, where everyone is white and Dutch, or Japan, where everyone is Japanese, or South Korea, where everyone is South Korean, you see high spending on social safety nets, education for all, free college, all of these things, right? Because, by the grace of God, there go I. Unless you're black, right? Or you're Hispanic, or you're Muslim in France, or, and then people say, well, not by the grace of God go I. That's not I. So to hell with them. And I know you want to say, well, that's not me, but on the aggregate, it is. And it's a hard truth that some of us need to come to terms with, because this is a data fact. It's a really interesting thing that I am still studying and I want to know more about, and about how to reduce these sorts of things. But it's a fact, and we find it in America, in the less heterogeneous states, or the more homogenous states, you get higher welfare spending. You also see it in school funding. We have set up our school funding system purposefully to harm the poor. Your school funding is based upon your local property taxes, right? And so if you're in the district, then your home's property taxes go to that district to fund 90% of their school funding. About 10 to 15% comes from the federal government and the state, but 85 to 90% comes from local property taxes. So if you're poor and you live in a garbage house, then you're going to go to a garbage school because your house is worth nothing, right? And the U.S. has decided that since you're poor, you deserve nothing. It's a brutal reality in the United States, and it's really, really hard to make the claim that there is equality of opportunity in this nation, like we want to claim, when school funding works this way, and when rich white kids and Asian kids are getting extraordinary resources, and poor black and Hispanic kids are getting no resources. And there are programs to help to equivocate these things, but they still exist, and they are vast differences in spending. And so it's something to think about. There has also been redlining. Historically, this is the idea that, like, if you came in and you were a black or Hispanic person, we're not going to give you a loan. or we're not going to sell you that house. We're not going to give you a mortgage. Because of just simple racism, period. Or maybe because your family doesn't have any money, because of institutional racism. Because your family has never had money, you've never been able to pass on money, you've always gone to the worst schools. This is a compounding problem, right? And this is not simply an American problem. Don't get me wrong. I'm trying to say that this happens everywhere that you see heterogeneous societies. But I'm trying to give you examples of how this works in the American context. And if you don't have access to mortgages, or a house, or land, or stocks, or bonds, or loans for a small business, or any of these things, then you cannot build wealth, and you cannot pass wealth on intergenerationally, and your generational line will never crawl itself out of the poverty gap, the poverty trap. And we are finding that the likelihood that you actually work your way out of your quintile that you were born in is extraordinarily unlikely and becoming unlikelier every day. The poor stay poor and the rich stay rich, and there's nothing that changes it, and it's becoming worse and worse and worse every year. There is no longer any upward mobility for the most part. Upward mobility is dying in America. And so that's another thing you should consider. All right. Man, we've been going for a long time. I'm calling it there. There's plenty there. Y'all have a wonderful day. I will get more content up soon. Please reach out to me if you did not receive a response saying, here's your test, it's noted and graded. Here's your paper, it's noted and graded. If you did not get that, please send me an email, okay? Trying to get caught up. You guys stay happy and healthy. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Bye.